The storm struck like a warning, wild and relentless, just as the last of the daylight faded from the Wyoming sky. Jake Marlowe stood at the window of his ranch house, staring into the darkness, watching the lightning cut the night open. The wind howled, pushing rain in sheets against the walls, and the sound of thunder shook the house to its core. He hadn't been inside this house alone in 18 months, ever since Sarah, his wife, had died. Since then, it was just him and his children, Emma, 8, and Lucas, 6, left to pick up the pieces of a life they didn't want to live anymore. The storm raged outside, but the silence inside felt even heavier. Then came a knock, hard and frantic, like someone was desperate for shelter. Jake stiffened, his hand instinctively gripping the rifle he kept near the door. He was no fool. Out here, in the wild frontier, the unexpected usually meant trouble. He opened the door, cautiously, the wind trying to slam it back in his face, and there she was. A woman drenched to the bone, her clothes torn, her face pale with exhaustion. Her eyes, wide with fear, met his as she collapsed onto his doorstep, barely able to speak. Jake froze, his heart beating in his chest like a drum. His first thought was to protect his children, but then Emma and Lucas appeared at the top of the stairs in their nightgowns, curious but wide-eyed with fear. The woman's eyes flickered toward them, and the faintest whisper escaped her lips, "Claire," running, before she lost consciousness in his arms. Jake's mind raced. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she running and from whom? But the answers would have to wait. He couldn't turn her away. Not in this storm. Not when she was so clearly in danger. His children stared down from the stairs, Emma's voice barely a whisper, but urgent. "Please, Daddy, let her stay." His eyes lingered on her small, hopeful face, and he felt a knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't that Jake didn't want to help. He did. But the memory of Sarah, the woman he'd loved so much, still haunted him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to let anyone else in. Especially not someone who had appeared at his doorstep like a storm itself, bringing with her unknown dangers. He couldn't forget Sarah, and the thought of opening his heart again felt impossible. But then he looked at the woman, Claire, she had whispered, and saw the wedding ring still clutched tightly in her hand, her wrists bruised, the remnants of a life she'd left behind. A life she was running from. Jake carefully picked her up, carrying her to the guest room, his children watching with wide eyes from the doorway. They were scared, but they were also hopeful. Hopeful that this stranger might be the answer to something they couldn't yet put into words. As Jake settled her onto the bed, his mind fought with his heart. He told himself it was nothing more than Christian charity, just a moment of kindness in the middle of a storm. But as he saw the way Emma and Lucas looked at her, he knew this was something more, something neither of them could have predicted. That night, as Jake lay in the darkness, a voice whispered through the house. Emma's voice, soft but clear, "She's the answer to my prayers, Daddy." And Jake knew, deep down, that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was brewing inside his heart. Something was changing, and whether he was ready or not, it was happening. The stranger in his house would change everything. As dawn broke over the ranch the next morning, Claire stirred, her eyes blinking open to the soft murmur of voices. The children, Emma and Lucas, were talking in the kitchen, their laughter strange but sweet, like a sound that hadn't been heard in this house in a long time. She shifted in the bed, the aches from her ride, the bruises on her wrists, all still there. But the warmth of the room, the safe silence, was something she hadn't experienced in months. Her eyes flickered toward the window, where the storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, crisp morning. She could hear Emma and Lucas bustling, though the noise was chaotic and uncoordinated. Eggs cracked on the floor, flour spilled across the table. Claire rose, her body protesting with each movement. But she had learned long ago how to ignore her exhaustion. She stepped into the hallway, and the sight that greeted her almost made her smile. Emma, determined but fumbling, stood on a chair, trying to stir the contents of a pot, while Lucas, more interested in the spoon than the meal itself, hovered around, trying to help in his own way. They looked up as she entered, their faces both hopeful and nervous, waiting for her reaction. Without saying a word, Claire moved toward them, and before either of the children could protest, she took over the task with practiced ease. She moved around the kitchen as if she had been here for years, setting to work without thinking. The children watched her with wide eyes, mesmerized by her confidence. Emma, ever the protector, hesitated before speaking. We weren't sure what to do," she admitted quietly. Claire smiled softly, her heart warming at the girl's honesty. "It's okay," she said gently. "I'll show you." She moved effortlessly, flipping the pancakes with grace, the smell filling the room. Jake, standing at the doorway, watched silently, noting the way Claire's hands worked, graceful and precise. Her movements were foreign to the rough ways of a frontier woman. Her clothes, even torn, were of finer quality than any woman he had ever seen around here. Her hands, though a little calloused, still held the softness of someone who had known a life of comfort. Her eyes, soft and kind, revealed a history Jake couldn't place, a world beyond the frontier. Yet, despite all her elegance, there was something about her that didn't quite add up. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something wasn't right. She was no drifter. As the morning went on, the kitchen filled with the sounds of breakfast, laughter, and light-hearted bickering between the children. Claire braided Emma's hair in a style Jake had never seen before, a simple but intricate braid that made the girl look even more like Sarah. It was then that something shifted in Lucas. He stood off to the side, eyes on the ribbon Claire was using to tie Emma's braid. It was the same ribbon his mother had once used for her own hair. Tentatively, Lucas stepped forward, holding it out in his small, trembling hand. "For you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Claire took the ribbon, touched by the gesture. She could feel the weight of the child's silent plea. His eyes, too, were full of something she had been missing for so long. Hope. She whispered a quiet thanks as she accepted the ribbon and placed it in her pocket. It was the first time Lucas had spoken in months. Jake's throat tightened as he watched, his eyes briefly welling with tears before he quickly wiped them away, not wanting to let the children see his weakness. But Claire had already noticed, and her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, a silent understanding passing between them. After breakfast, Claire hesitated, standing by the door, uncertain of what came next. "I could leave," she offered quietly. "I don't want to cause trouble." Jake, his hand on a rifle by the door, shook his head. "Where would you go?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in his own children's faces after Sarah had died, after everything had changed. Claire hesitated, looking down at the floor before answering. "West, somewhere safe," she said, her voice distant, as if the words themselves were painful to speak. Jake could see the terror flickering in her eyes at the mention of a nearby town. The children, sensing the tension, grew more anxious. Emma stepped forward, her little face drawn with worry. "But she just got here. Please, Daddy, we need help with," she trailed off, unable to finish, but her meaning was clear. She needed Claire. It was almost as if the girl had known the weight of the words long before they were spoken. Jake didn't want to admit it, but the truth was he needed her too. His farm, his life, it had been falling apart ever since Sarah's death, and there was something about Claire that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe she could bring back the life they had lost. "You can stay," Jake said, the words surprising even him. "Stay until you figure out where you're going. You can help with the children, the house, the garden." The words felt strange in his mouth, but as he said them, he realized how much he needed her here. The children needed her. He couldn't let her go. Not yet. Claire's face softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, she seemed to relax. The weight of her secrets, her fears, could be postponed just a little longer. She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The children cheered, their joy breaking the tension that had settled over the house. But in the back of Jake's mind, something was still nagging at him. As the day wore on, a ranch hand mentioned seeing a rider on the ridge at dawn, watching the house. Jake felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. His hand instinctively went to the rifle, his instincts telling him that something was off. Something about this woman didn't sit right with him. Her horse, tied outside, wasn't the kind of horse a drifter would have. Expensive saddle, quality breeding, it didn't add up. And when he looked closer at the saddlebags, he noticed fine dresses, jewelry hidden in the lining, and a small bundle of money sewn into the hem. There were no letters, no family Bible, no identification. Nothing that would tell him who she really was. That night, as Claire settled into the guest room, Emma slipped a drawing under the door, a picture of two small figures holding hands with a woman labeled Claire, and apart, a man alone labeled Daddy. It was a simple drawing, but the message was clear: bring him back to us. In the barn, Jake found fresh hoof prints circling the property, a sign that someone had been watching. Whoever Claire was running from wasn't finished. The storm had brought her here, but it had also brought trouble. And the longer she stayed, the closer that danger would come. The days that followed passed in a blur of routine, with Claire slowly becoming a part of the Marlowe family. The mornings were spent in the kitchen, where she taught Emma how to make Sarah's famous cinnamon rolls, each turn of the dough a quiet reminder of the life that had been. The children flourished under her care. Emma found comfort in the familiar rhythms of the kitchen, and Lucas, once a shadow of the boy he used to be, began to speak more, his voice timid at first but growing with each passing day. Claire worked tirelessly in Sarah's garden, bringing it back to life, pulling weeds and planting seeds, and the flowers slowly began to bloom again. The sight of the garden flourishing brought something Jake hadn't felt in so long: hope. Each evening, after the long hours of work, the family gathered by the fire, and Claire would read to them, her voice soft but strong. It was a small thing, but it brought a sense of normalcy, something that had been missing since Sarah's death. Jake would sit in his chair, pipe in hand, watching the family he had almost given up on. His heart softened as he saw Emma and Lucas, their eyes full of wonder as they listened to Claire's voice fill the room. And for the first time in months, he felt like maybe they had a chance at healing. But even as the days passed and the family seemed to grow closer, there was always a nagging feeling at the back of Jake's mind. He couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Claire was too composed, too graceful for a woman who had been living on the run. Her hands, though worn from work, still carried the elegance of someone who had once known a different life. And there were times when her eyes would drift toward the horizon with a look of such deep sorrow that Jake couldn't help but wonder what she was hiding. His suspicions grew when, one Sunday, they made the trip to town for church. The small, tight-knit community welcomed Claire with polite but curious stares. The men tipped their hats, and the women exchanged whispers behind their fans. Widow Thompson, the town's most outspoken gossip, wasted no time in cornering Jake after the service. "I don't suppose you'll be telling us where she came from?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Jake kept his face impassive. "She's helping with the children. That's all you need to know." But Widow Thompson wasn't satisfied. "Funny, she doesn't look like a ranch woman," she muttered, eyeing Claire as she stood beside him. Claire stood tall, her back straight, but her eyes darted nervously toward the ground. The preacher's wife, though kind in her demeanor, also seemed to be probing, asking questions that made Claire uncomfortable. "It must be quite a change for you, dear," she said, her voice dripping with hidden meaning. "A city woman, living out here in the wilderness. I hope the Lord is guiding you on your way." Claire nodded, her smile tight, but she didn't respond. She was doing her best to fit in, but there were times when Jake could see the strain on her face, the way she would tense up when anyone asked too many questions. As they left the church, Emma clung to her side, protective of her in a way that only a child could be. Lucas walked quietly beside them, his hand tightly gripping Claire's. Jake, walking a few steps ahead, tried to ignore the whispers behind him. It was clear that Claire's presence was raising questions, and though he tried to dismiss it, he couldn't help but feel that the danger that had followed her was closer than he realized. The next day, Jake heard a rumor in town. A stranger, a man from out of town, had been asking questions, describing Claire in great detail. He had asked the blacksmith about the woman who had recently arrived at Jake Marlowe's ranch. "She's a fine-looking woman," the man had said. "Came in on a horse with a fancy saddle. Not the kind of horse a drifter would have, you know." The blacksmith had been suspicious, but the man had just smiled and left, continuing his search for the woman with the expensive saddle. Jake's gut tightened as he listened to the story. There was no doubt in his mind that this man was looking for Claire. Who was he? And why was he so determined to find her? Jake's protective instincts kicked in. He started keeping a closer eye on the horizon, scanning the ridge each morning for any sign of movement. He didn't want to involve the sheriff yet, not when he didn't have enough information. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, Claire's fear became more evident with each passing day. She flinched at the slightest noise, her eyes darting around whenever someone approached the house. And yet, when Jake asked her directly if there was something she was hiding, she only offered vague answers. "I'm just trying to move on," she would say. "It's better if I don't talk about it." It wasn't until one evening, as the family sat around the fire, that Claire finally spoke about her past. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Emma to ask the question Jake had been avoiding. "Where's your husband, Claire?" Emma asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. Claire hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darkening. "Somewhere I pray he never finds me," she said, her voice breaking. Emma, wise beyond her years, hugged her tightly. "Did he hurt you?" she asked, and Claire went still. The silence spoke volumes. Jake watched, anger and protectiveness rising in his chest, but he said nothing. Claire had already told him more than she had planned. That night, as Jake sat outside, the weight of her words settled on him. He didn't need to hear any more. It was clear that Claire had been running from someone, a man who had hurt her, who still wanted to find her. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His protective instinct flared. Whoever this man was, Jake wasn't going to let him anywhere near his family. Not now. Not ever. But the next day, as Jake worked around the ranch, his thoughts were interrupted by a visit from the sheriff. He had received word that Marcus Hartford, the man who had been asking about Claire, had sent a telegram from Boston. The sheriff mentioned casually that Hartford was offering a reward for information about his missing wife. Jake's blood ran cold. The storm had brought Claire to his doorstep, but it was only a matter of time before the storm found its way to them. The days felt heavier now, each one weighing Jake down more than the last, as he tried to balance the growing tension of their uncertain future with the small joys he found in Claire's presence. It was the fourth week since the storm had brought her to the Marlowe ranch, and with each passing day, something deeper than just gratitude began to grow between them. The children thrived under Claire's care. Emma had begun to smile again, and Lucas, once silent, had started to speak more freely, even laughing at the smallest of things. Claire had become an integral part of their daily lives, teaching Emma how to cook Sarah's old recipes, working the garden that Sarah had once tended so lovingly, and reading to the children by the fire each night, the stories filling the house with a warmth it hadn't known in far too long. Jake watched it all from the corner of his eye, trying to keep his emotions in check. It wasn't that he didn't care for Claire. He did, more than he'd cared for anyone since Sarah had died. But he fought it. The guilt was always there, gnawing at him. Every smile he shared with Claire felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory. Every touch, every moment of tenderness. He told himself it wasn't fair to either of them, but the truth was his heart had started to soften in ways he hadn't allowed it to since Sarah passed. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Jake found himself sitting beside Claire on the porch, the stars bright above them. the stillness of the night pressing in around them. The coyotes howled in the distance, but it was their silence that spoke loudest. The years of grief and loss had made Jake cautious, guarded. But as he sat there, he realized how much he wanted to reach out, how much he longed to tell her the truth of what he was feeling. "Claire," he said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant, "what are you running from?" It was the question he had been avoiding, the question that had haunted him since the moment she had arrived. He needed to know. Claire's gaze turned distant, her hands tightening around the mug of tea she had been holding. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Jake thought she might not answer at all. But then her voice broke the silence, soft and tinged with sorrow. "My name is Claire Elizabeth Hartford," she said, her voice trembling just slightly as she spoke the name that had once meant safety, security, and wealth, but now only felt like a chain around her neck. "I was married to Marcus Hartford. He's wealthy, powerful. He has connections, money, everything a man could want. But it wasn't enough for him." Claire's voice faltered as she spoke, her eyes darkening. "At first, it was all fine. I thought I had married into the life I dreamed of, a life of comfort. But over time, things changed. He became more controlling, more distant. He started isolating me from everyone, from my family, from my friends. He began to hurt me, slowly at first, words, insults, little things. But then it became more." She stopped, her hands shaking as she clasped them tightly together in her lap. Jake's blood ran cold as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "He hurt you," Jake said softly, his voice thick with anger. He abused you." Claire didn't respond right away, but the silence spoke volumes. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and she nodded, her throat tight. "Yes," she whispered. "And the last straw, I was pregnant. I lost the baby. He pushed me down the stairs." Jake's heart clenched at her words, and his fists curled into tight, furious balls at his sides. The man she had married, this Marcus Hartford, had done this to her. He had taken everything from her, stripped away her sense of safety, her sense of self. Jake could feel the raw anger rising in him, and the need to protect her, to keep her safe, burned hotter than anything he had ever felt before. "I planned my escape for months," Claire continued, her voice barely audible now. "I waited for him to leave on a business trip, and when he did, I ran. I rode west, away from him. I had nowhere else to go." Her eyes met Jake's then, and he saw the raw fear in them. "I thought maybe I could find a new life out here. Maybe I could disappear, but I don't know how long I can outrun him." Jake didn't know what to say. His mind was reeling from everything Claire had just revealed. The man who had done this to her. He was coming for her, and he was powerful. His money, his connections, they could follow her anywhere. But here, in this house, on this land, he would not lay a hand on her. "He won't find you," Jake said, his voice firm, more certain than he felt. "Not here." Claire looked at him, her eyes full of disbelief and sorrow. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He has the law on his side. He has money, influence. He can do whatever he wants. The sheriff is his friend. The town will turn on me. I don't know how to fight him." Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't some rich man with connections and influence, but out here, the law was what was right. And right now, what was right was keeping Claire safe. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Out here, we don't have a lot of fancy rules," he said quietly. "But we have what's right. And what's right is you staying here. And no one is going to hurt you again." The promise hung between them, thick with unspoken understanding. Claire didn't answer, but she squeezed his hand, and Jake knew, in that moment, that he had made a decision. He would fight for her. He would fight for this family, for the chance to finally move on from the ghosts of the past. But as the days passed, the danger became more real. The telegram from Marcus Hartford had arrived at the general store. Jake had learned of it through the sheriff, who had come to him with the news. Marcus was offering a $500 reward for information about his wife. And the whole town knew now. The gossip was out of control, and the pressure was building. Some people in the town began to question Claire's presence at the Marlowe ranch, whispering about the reward, about the legal implications of harboring a fugitive wife. Others, like the doctor's wife, saw the signs of abuse and knew Claire was telling the truth. But the town was divided. The threat of Marcus was real now. Jake could feel it in his bones. He knew the man was coming soon. And when he did, it would take everything they had to keep him from tearing them apart. The day Marcus Hartford arrived felt like the calm before the storm, an eerie silence hanging over the ranch as Jake stood by the barn, scanning the horizon, waiting for the inevitable. The morning air was still, the only sounds the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk. Jake had spent the last few days preparing, every instinct screaming at him to be ready. He had told Claire to stay inside with the children, but his eyes kept drifting back to the road, where the dust would soon rise from the approaching riders. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the unknown settling on his shoulders. When the riders finally appeared, it was like a page out of a nightmare. 6 men in total, with Marcus Hartford at the lead. He was everything Jake had imagined. Tall, well-groomed, impeccably dressed in fine clothes that looked out of place on the rugged frontier. There was something cold about him, something calculating in the way he held himself, as if the world was his to command. Jake's grip on his rifle tightened as the group drew closer, the hooves of the horses pounding against the earth. Marcus's cold eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, Jake saw the man's calculated smile. He was used to getting what he wanted, and Jake knew, deep down, that this was going to be a battle. As they dismounted, the other men fanned out, their eyes scanning the ranch. But Marcus stayed close to Jake, his smile never leaving his face. "Jake Marlowe," Marcus said smoothly, his voice a perfect blend of charm and control. "I appreciate you taking such good care of my wife. I'm sure it hasn't been easy, but she's mine, and I'm here to bring her home." Jake's jaw clenched, his mind racing. He wasn't about to let this man, this monster, take Claire away from him. "She's not going anywhere," Jake replied, his voice steady, though the anger simmered just below the surface. Marcus's smile faltered for a split second, but only long enough for Jake to see the flicker of rage in his eyes. "Now, Jake," Marcus said, his tone condescending, "I'm sure you've heard the rumors. The telegram, the reward. You don't want to make this difficult. All I want is my wife, and then we can both go our separate ways." Jake took a step forward, the rifle resting on his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. "She's not your wife anymore. She's free, and she's staying here with us." The words came out with more force than he intended, but they were true. He wasn't about to let Claire go back to that life, to the man who had hurt her, who had stolen her peace and her safety. Marcus's eyes narrowed, and the facade of the charming, well-dressed gentleman slipped away, replaced by something far more dangerous. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Jake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I made a lot of powerful friends, and I can make your life very difficult. If you want to keep your ranch, your children, and your life, you'll hand her over." At that, the tension in the air thickened, and Jake's hand instinctively tightened around the rifle. He had heard the threats before, but this time it was different. The stakes were higher. The threat wasn't just to him. It was to Claire, to Emma, to Lucas. They were all in danger. But Jake was not going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "She stays," Jake said again, his voice hard. "And you leave." Now, Marcus took a step forward, his eyes flashing with anger. But before he could say anything more, Claire appeared on the porch. She stood there for a moment, her posture tense, as if she had already anticipated what was coming. Her eyes met Jake's, and for a brief second, there was a silent understanding between them. She was scared, yes, but she wasn't going anywhere. She had found something here, something she hadn't realized she was looking for, and she wasn't going to let Marcus take it from her. "I'm not going with you," Claire said, her voice clear and steady, though Jake could hear the tremor beneath it. She walked slowly down the steps, her eyes never leaving Marcus. I'm not your property anymore." Marcus's face twisted in fury, his mask of civility slipping as he stepped toward her, his hand outstretched. "You don't know what you're saying, Claire," he spat. "You're mine. You always will be." But as he reached for her, a hand shot out from behind Claire. Jake's hand, gripping her wrist and pulling her behind him, shielding her with his body. "I said, she stays," Jake repeated, his voice unwavering. Marcus looked from Jake to Claire, his eyes burning with anger. And for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he stopped. The cold calculation returned to his eyes as he took a step back, his lips curling into a smile. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won? We'll see how long that lasts." He turned to his men, and with a quick motion, they began to mount their horses. "This isn't over, Jake," Marcus warned, his eyes narrowing. "I'll be back, and when I return, it won't just be you I'm coming for." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud as Marcus spurred his horse into motion, the others following close behind. The group disappeared into the distance, leaving Jake and Claire standing there, still. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened, but Jake wasn't about to let his guard down. He knew Marcus wasn't the type of man to let things go. Not ever. "They're gone," Jake said quietly, turning to Claire, his voice softening. "But it's not over. We'll be ready when he comes back." Claire nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly, but the words carried a strength that Jake had never heard in her before. It was a promise, one that filled him with a new sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, they were standing together, united. And together, they would face whatever came next. The days that followed Marcus's departure were heavy with the weight of uncertainty, but also with a quiet sense of resolve. Jake spent hours with the ranch hands, preparing the property for whatever was to come next. Every evening, his eyes would drift toward the horizon, scanning for any sign of movement. He had heard Marcus's threats, and he knew the man wouldn't back down easily, but Jake wasn't the type to run. Not anymore. He'd fought for his children, for Sarah, and now he was ready to fight for Claire. The tension in the air was thick, but it was nothing compared to the day Marcus had arrived. Jake wasn't afraid of the man's threats. What he feared was the possibility that the community, which had once seemed so accepting, might turn against them. There had been whispers, subtle glances, but the support of a few key people had made all the difference. The doctor's wife, who had witnessed Claire's abuse firsthand, had stepped forward, quietly offering her support. The preacher, once so staunch in his belief in the sanctity of marriage, had begun to question Marcus's motives, and his quiet support in town meetings had given Jake a glimmer of hope that the town might stand with him. Jake had taken his concerns to a lawyer in a nearby town, a man he trusted, but the news was grim. There was no solid proof of abuse, no witnesses to support Claire's claims. A divorce would be nearly impossible to obtain, especially with Marcus's wealth and connections. But Jake was determined. He wasn't going to let Marcus win. Late one afternoon, as Jake was out checking the fences, he received a visit from the sheriff, who had come to deliver news. The telegram had arrived in the morning, and Jake had been expecting it. Marcus Hartford had made good on his promise, and he was coming back, bringing with him federal marshals. Jake felt his heart drop, but the resolve in his chest only hardened. They didn't have much time, but there was a plan. With the help of the lawyer and the town's growing support, Jake had one last card to play. The sheriff, though bound by the law, had agreed to stand with him. The community, too, had begun to rally. They knew what Marcus was capable of, and they weren't about to let him destroy another family. When the day came, Jake gathered the ranch hands, the townspeople who had offered their support, and anyone else who was willing to stand with them. The plan was simple. They would face Marcus head-on, not as a group of people cowering in fear, but as a united front, ready to fight for what was right. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as Jake stood on the porch, waiting for Marcus's arrival. He knew this was it. This was the moment that would define everything. Claire, standing beside him, looked up at him with a mixture of fear and something else, something stronger. Hope. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the unspoken promise in her eyes. She was with him now, and they were in this together. When the first sound of hooves reached Jake's ears, he knew it was time. He turned to Claire, squeezing her hand tightly. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "we'll face it together. We're not running anymore." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with determination. She didn't need to say anything. The words weren't necessary. They had already made their stand. As Marcus and his group of riders appeared on the horizon, Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm, his rifle by his side, ready. The other townspeople had gathered, standing with him, their faces resolute, their backs straight with a quiet courage that spoke volumes. Marcus's group pulled up to the ranch, dismounting and gathering in front of Jake, their expressions cold, calculating. Marcus's eyes, filled with fury, locked onto Jake. "You think you've won?" Marcus sneered. "This isn't over. I'll make sure of it. You and your whole family will pay for defying me." Jake stood tall, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't get to decide who stays and who goes anymore. Marcus," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Claire is free, and you're never going to hurt her again. You're not welcome here." Marcus's face twisted in anger, but Jake could see the cracks in his facade. The man was furious, yes, but he was starting to realize that he didn't have the power here. Not anymore. The townspeople stood firm, a united front, and Jake knew that the support of the community, their willingness to stand with them, was the turning point. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Marcus Hartford," he said, his eyes steady. "I've received word from the Boston Diocese. Your first wife, the one you claimed had died, is alive and in an asylum. Your marriage to Claire is illegal, and everything you've done is now under investigation." The color drained from Marcus's face as the truth of his deception hit him like a physical blow. "What?" Marcus gasped, his voice laced with disbelief. "That's impossible." The preacher stepped forward, holding out a telegram. "It's true," he said quietly, "and it makes your claims null and void. You never had the legal right to Claire in the first place." The air around them seemed to freeze as the truth settled in. Marcus Hartford, the powerful man who had thought he could control everything, was exposed. His empire of lies had crumbled. The sheriff, his face grim, turned to Marcus. "You're free to leave, Hartford. If you ever come back here, you'll be arrested. You'll never hurt anyone again." The shock on Marcus's face was evident, but there was nothing he could do. His world, built on manipulation and control, was falling apart around him. He turned, his face a mask of fury, but there was nothing left for him here. The marshal's power had crumbled. The support of the town was too strong. Marcus's eyes met Claire's for one last moment, filled with rage and disbelief, before he turned and mounted his horse. "This isn't over," he spat. "I will find a way to ruin you all." Jake watched as Marcus rode off, his words fading into the distance. But as the dust settled and the town began to breathe a collective sigh of relief, Jake turned to Claire, his eyes meeting hers. She was free, truly free, and with that freedom, they could begin again. The ranch, the children, the life they had all started to rebuild. It was theirs, and no one would take it from them. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had won, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ranch, he knew that this was just the beginning of their new life together. 3 months had passed since Marcus Hartford's departure, and the change in the Marlowe Ranch was undeniable. The garden, once overrun with weeds and neglect, was now flourishing under Claire's careful hands. The children had blossomed in ways Jake could only have dreamed of before. Emma, once so burdened by the weight of her mother's death, now spent her days humming as she worked alongside Claire, picking wildflowers and laughing. Lucas, who had barely spoken in months, now chattered endlessly, his voice no longer filled with the silence of sorrow. Claire had become not just a caretaker, but a mother in every sense of the word, and Jake found himself falling for her all over again. This time not out of guilt or obligation, but out of a deep, undeniable love. It was the last Sunday of the season, and the ranch was alive with a quiet anticipation that seemed to fill the very air. Claire had spent the morning preparing, and the children were positively giddy, barely able to contain their excitement. Emma had even spent the night before sewing little flowers into the fabric of Claire's wedding dress. A simple, white gown she had fashioned from cloth that had been sent by the town seamstress. There was no grand ceremony planned, no extravagant feast. This wasn't about showing off or impressing anyone. It was about love, a love that had endured trials, hardships, and the threat of destruction, and now it was ready to be celebrated. The day was bright and clear, the sun shining down on the ranch in a way that made everything seem golden. As the guests began to arrive, there was a sense of warmth and unity that made Jake's heart swell. The people who had once looked at Claire with suspicion now greeted her with open arms. Even Widow Thompson, who had questioned Claire's past, was among those present, her arms wide as she embraced Claire in a show of support. The preacher, who had once been so rigid in his judgment of Claire's situation, stood by with a soft smile, and even the sheriff, who had once feared the power of Marcus Hartford, offered a respectful nod to Jake. It was a community now bound by something stronger than just shared geography. They had come together in defense of what was right, what was good, and today they would celebrate the family that had been formed from that unity. Claire stood on the porch, the soft fabric of her dress flowing around her as Emma placed the final touches on her hair, arranging the flowers just so. Lucas, beaming with pride, stood beside her, holding the small bouquet he had picked from the garden. Jake, standing at the end of the porch with his children, couldn't help but feel a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was what he had fought for. This was the life that had been denied to him for so long. As Claire turned toward him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, the world seemed to stand still. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had ever imagined, not because of the dress or the flowers in her hair, but because of the strength and courage she had shown since the moment she had arrived at his doorstep. She had been running from a life that had tried to break her, but now she was walking toward a future filled with love, with hope. Claire took a deep breath and smiled, walking toward Jake, her arm resting on his as she joined him at the altar. The children stood behind them, Emma holding Lucas's hand tightly as she looked on with eager anticipation. The preacher's voice was soft but steady as he spoke the vows that would bind them together forever. Jake, his voice thick with emotion, promised to protect Claire, to cherish her not just as his wife, but as the woman who had brought light back into their lives. He promised to honor her past and to build a future with her, a future filled with love and laughter. Claire, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word, vowed to stay by Jake's side through every storm, to love him as the man who had shown her what true family meant. And she promised to love his children as her own, to never run from them, but always toward them. When Jake placed a ring on Claire's finger, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic moments, just two people bound by love and by the promise of a future they would build together. The kiss they shared was not just the joining of lips, but the joining of hearts. And as they pulled apart, the crowd erupted into applause. Emma's voice rang out above the rest, her excited shout of "They're really married now," making everyone laugh. After the ceremony, the celebration was simple but joyous. The ranch hands had strung up wildflowers and lanterns, and the townspeople had brought food to share. The fiddle played, and the laughter of friends and family echoed across the land as Jake and Claire danced together, the children by their side, laughing and spinning as if the world had finally returned to its rightful place. Old Charlie, the ranch foreman, raised a glass to Jake with a grin. "To the boss finding what he thought he'd lost," he said with a wink. The doctor's wife, standing by Claire, raised her own glass and added, "To Claire, the bravest woman I've ever known." The rest of the town raised their glasses in a chorus of well wishes. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. The storm had passed, and what had emerged in its wake was not just survival, but a new beginning. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the ranch, Jake found himself standing with Claire, watching their children play together in the yard, their laughter ringing out like music. Claire's hand rested lightly in his, and for the first time in years, Jake allowed himself to hope. This was home, not because of the land, not because of the house, but because of the people who stood beside him. The family he had always wanted, the family he had fought so hard to protect, was finally complete. That night, as the stars lit up the sky, Claire took a quiet moment to visit Sarah's grave. She knelt by the tombstone, placing the flowers she had picked earlier in the day, whispering a quiet thanks to the woman who had brought Jake into the world, who had helped raise the children Claire now loved as her own. "Thank you for your family," Claire whispered, her voice soft and sincere. "I'll love them well." Jake found her there, standing in the quiet, and when he placed a hand on her shoulder, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "She'd like you," Jake said softly, his voice filled with tenderness. Claire nodded, a smile forming on her lips. "I hope so," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm living her dream now." Jake's heart swelled as he looked at her, realizing that Claire was not just living her own dream, but the dream they had all shared. "No," Jake said, pulling her into his arms, "you're living ours. All of ours." Together, they had built something beautiful, something stronger than either of them had ever imagined. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, with the stars shining above them and the laughter of their children in the background, Jake knew that they had found what they were meant to find: a family, a home, and a future filled with love. The storm had brought them together, but it was the love they shared that would carry them forward forever.